1929, Dad started farming. He farmed for 6 years and never had a crop. The year I was born in 1934, he had the crop all in on my birthday, April 27th. And on Memorial Day, it was all blown out completely with the dust storm. So he had no crop. I was born in the farmhouse. Our address was Michigan at that time. Quit farming in 1936. When he moved to town, that's when my sister was born. My dad and his brother-in-law would put up ice in the wintertime and put it in with sawdust on it. So for ice boxes, because during the 30s and early 40s there were no refrigerators, and he would deliver ice to their homes. And when he cut it off, there was always chips of ice, and he'd throw them to the side and put sawdust on them. And my brother and I, we got to sell those chips for people, because in those days everybody made homemade ice cream. On the 4th of July, we made a lot of money. We'd sell it for 10 and 15 cents for a bucket of ice, or enough for making ice cream. But at the end of the war, you see, you weren't able to buy refrigerators. We bought our first refrigerator in 1946. I was 12 years old. We bought it on my birthday, April 27th, 34. And the first thing we made, we really were excited. We made popsicles. We thought that was the greatest thing in the world. I don't think kids would think that much of making popsicles today, but we did. So when I was 14 years old, I was in the 8th grade. And this farmer that I'd been raking hay for, he had a brand new LA Case tractor, and I got $48 a week for driving that tractor. And that thing took 65 gallons of fuel. In those days, farmers didn't have pickups, so he had to haul gasoline. It was a gasoline tractor. He had to haul it out in his car, in his trunk. And so then I had to pour that in, and I was so short. I can't believe that pouring that gasoline in on a hot tractor, that sometimes I didn't spill enough and started on fire. When I was 15 years old, next year, he bought an R John Deere. It was a diesel. It only took 18 gallons of fuel, but it didn't have near the power. But that was really a treat not to fill it on, because we'd drive home at nights and fill it up from the tank. Those are long days. I worked from 7 to 7 and got the $48. January the 16th, I can remember that so well. I was 16 years old, and I walked downtown to an insurance agent all by myself and told him I wanted to buy a life insurance policy, because my dad had always said he took one out when he was young, but he had to cash it in during the 30s with the Depression. So I thought I should buy one. So I bought a 20-pay life for $30.30 a year. And now that policy is worth around $9,000.
You played football a couple years, didn't you?
Yeah, I played in my freshman and sophomore years. Yeah, I was so light that I was always hoping that I'd get to be 140 pounds, but I never gained that much when I graduated in high school, even because I was working all the time, I think, so I never gained any weight. But we didn't have no face masks on our helmets or nothing, and our pads, our rib pads was just some thin leather things that were strapped on. And I played on a field in Northwood, North Dakota, the next game after a boy got a concussion and he died from it. After I got through with that farmer, he kind of tried to take advantage of me. He was going to give me a bonus that last year, and he didn't give me anything. And I said, I thought I was supposed to get a bonus. And he asked me, do you think you deserved it? And I said, well, I've worked for you for about 6 years. You should have known that when you offered me the bonus when I started in the spring. And I stuck to my end. So he brought my dad a check for $25. So the next year he wanted to hire me again after I was through high school. And I said, no, you took advantage of me once and you're not going to get the second chance.
What do you remember about Grandpa when you were working with him, with your dad?
Well, he had back problems. And my brother and I, at the Johnson store, they had a big bin, and we'd haul many loads in there, and you had to shovel it back. And so him and I would try to bury him in the bin. So we'd go as fast as we could to the boxcar and load it as fast with 2 wheel scoops, and we'd get back. I think we'd load a ton and a half in 10 minutes or more, and we'd go and dump it and try to bury him in the bin. But you could never bury Grandpa, even with a bad back. He had a strap he'd put on his back when it was real bad. He one time slipped, and he didn't even realize it. And later a doctor asked him, when did you break your back? And he said, I didn't know I broke my back. I hurt it real bad, and he wore a belt all the time. But so they had operated on his brain, and they had him strapped down because he wanted to pull, and he broke the strap that held him down. And they asked me, "What'd that guy do for a living?" They said, "No one he's ever broke one of those straps." And they said he broke it. My dad was a hard physical work, but he did all kinds of handiwork. That was one thing when we were, back in those days there was no TVs, and we did a lot of fancy work. My dad did embroidering and knitting and all that sort of stuff, and so I never did any of that. I did embroidery. Did a lot of embroidery. We always did all the pillowcases and tablecloths and stuff, but then I didn't start doing the knitting until Libby was 2 years old, and we come back from Linton. I stopped at my dad's, and I thought, we're going to lose this knack of having this. I should learn. And I started then when Libby was 2 years old. I was back in '93. And so I made a lot of Afghans. And I've given all the grandchildren their Afghans for their baptism for when they have a baby. I did it for Amber and my two grandchildren, yeah. He took care of my mother after she had a stroke. And then later she wound up and had to go to the hospital. He'd walk to the hospital twice a day to take care of her, and he'd play cards with her in the evenings, and he'd go home all through the winter when it was icy and that even.
He played her hand for her too.
No, she'd hold her own hand, but he maybe would have to help her occasionally, yeah. So I talked to my dad's dad. He was from Denmark, and he went to Sweden, and when he got over to Sweden, the war was on, and he didn't want to go in the war, so he went on the ship to come to America. Because when I started barbering, I was telling him how much I got for haircuts, and he couldn't believe I could charge $1 for a haircut. Because he said when he was farming, the federal government gave them a penny a gopher to shoot gophers. The county job, they had a lot of guys that did a lot of drinking, so on Monday mornings they wouldn't show up, so they started letting me run a push cat to push the scrapers to load them. And so then later guys didn't show up, and I got to run a dozer, and then I got lucky enough I got to run a cat on a scraper. So I was really lucky. I got 90 cents an hour. That was pretty good pay, and I got 10-cent bonus at the end of the year. And those guys were the ones that recommended to me. They said, this is okay for us, but you should go to barber school. Look at those two guys in Macville. They do real well at barbering. And so I thought that sounded pretty good. So I called Wahpeton Trade School, and they said, well, we don't have a barber school, but there's one in Fargo, Moeller Barber School in Fargo. So I called there, and I went. I went down to the school, and when I signed up, the Korean War was on, so they only had 7 students. On the second day, they hadn't given me any lessons, and I'd never cut a head of hair in my life. And they gave me my equipment on the second day. And this young couple was going on vacation, and so they brought their son in with them to get a haircut, and they wanted it trimmed. So I started going up the sides, and that didn't look very good, so I kept going higher, and it didn't look good until I was pretty high up. After a while, I was running out of hair, so I thought I'd better call the inspector. The inspector comes, and he says, I told him he wants it trimmed. And he says, how in the hell can I trim it when you cut the hair all off? The bus depot would give room and board if I worked an hour in the mornings, and I could get 3 meals a day. So I worked in the mornings from 5 to 6, then I'd go to school at 8, and I got through at school at 5. And then there was a gas station. I worked at the gas station, and they had a parking lot. They used to get 10 cents a car for parking in the parking lot. And they had me check the till out and everything. I was just 18 years old at the time, because I paid all my own way through college. I never got any help from home or any loans. In 1953, I started in Devil's Lake, my first job. We got $1. Then I filled in at my hometown, Macville, where those guys thought the barbers were making so much money. I helped him out when he went on vacation. He only got charged 65 cents there. So I worked in Devil's Lake for 1 year, but Grand Forks haircuts were $1.25, and that looked pretty good to me. started out there with $1.25, and I was really privileged because the Dakota Hotel was brand new, and it was 3 barbers in there. I had to just take the overflow. We did a lot of shaving back in '54, and the Dakota Hotel had a lot of traveling salespeople. Not boasting, but I was good at shaving, so I did all the shaving. The other guys didn't, and so it was quite normal. I would get a dollar for a shave, but it was quite common. Those guys, for haircuts, they'd only give you a 25's a tip, but that's a big tip when you think percentage-wise on $1.25 haircut. But sometimes I'd get a $2 from those guys for a shave. So that was a lot of money. I really thought that was great. Didn't ever think about it any different than it was just a way of making a living. It was a lot easier than working on the dray line. Well, I met her when we were young, 16, 17 years old. We were going to dances, and I met her there, but I didn't have anything to do with her at that time. I went with some of her girlfriends, and she would always say when I would come, she'd say to those other girls, "There comes LeRoyPederson." And so then I'd dance. I don't even recall that I even danced with your mother at that time. But I liked to dance, so I did a lot of dancing. And so then Mother moved to Macville my senior year. She quit school when she was a sophomore. There were 11 children in her family, and so it was pretty hard times. And so she started working and making her own money for clothes and helped buy clothes for some of the children, even other children. And so then she'd come to Macville. We started going together at that time. And so then when I went to Fargo, she says it's a coincidence, but one of her girlfriends broke up with her boyfriend, so they were going to go to Fargo to get a job doing waitress work. So she come to Fargo, so I went with her. She was in Fargo then, because I'd gone with her in Macville. So then I got my first job in Devil's Lake, and she consequently moved back to Tolna. So I started seeing her again in Tolna then when I was in Devil's Lake. Well, then when I moved to Grand Forks, another coincidence happened. One of her girlfriends broke up with her boyfriend, and so they come to Grand Forks. So I always said she was following me, so I might as well marry her. But my dad took me down. We went down to the local drugstore, and we ordered the diamond ring there in the drugstore. We went out to Louise's dad. He was working on a construction crew at that time. He was laying concrete at night, and he was trawling it. So we drove out there, and she showed him our engagement ring. And he says to me, "I didn't think you'd ever be that foolish, Leroy," he said. She was 21 the next month, and I wasn't 21 for four months later. We moved to Edinburgh, and this guy wanted to leave. So then we took and bought this barber shop, and I was going to move up there, and then we decided, well, we might as well get married. But we got married shortly after we got engaged. So there's a lot of tongues waggling then when they thought we got married shortly after we got engaged. But Merle was never born for a year and a half later, so he must have been an elephant because it lasted so long. The church meant a lot to Louise. Mother was very active in the church. She was one of the big leaders. She became a full-time custodian in 1983, so she was a full-time custodian for about 17 years. I suppose out of the 64 years, she was either the vice president or the president at least 30 years. We went back to Macville and had all our shower stuff packed up. On Wednesday, we moved on Wednesday to the barber shop. And when we got there before dinner, and the kids were sitting on the hall steps there for something for school, they all come over and helped unload the trailer. I started cutting hair at 1 o'clock on day one. I had thought when I moved to Edinburgh I'd spend 5-6 years there because the guy ahead of me had been there for 27 years, and I thought he was crazy if he would spend 27 years in that little town. And here, my wife, we raised all our family there. We were there for 64 years, so it must have been really something wrong with me. The barber shop had an apartment in back. It was a building 24 by 50. When we bought it, it had running cold water and a pump on the kitchen sink. And the barber shop, it didn't have hot water in the kitchen. But at the barber shop, we had to have hot water. We had a little heater there that was run by gravity. We'd fill a tank up so we had hot and cold water for the barber shop. It had, on the main floor, it had like we called it a bedroom and a kitchen and a living room and a bathroom and another little room. And so then when the boys come along, there was bedrooms upstairs, and that was right above the barber shop, and that was a room 20 by 24, and that's where the boys all slept. And they had basketball hoop up there, and they'd be shooting baskets, and I'd have to go stop them because it was banging on the floor and I was busy in the barber shop. But when they go by the drugstore, they wanted to buy a book, and I always let them buy those childcraft books, I think was the name of them, and they'd buy those books, and they had stacks of them. And we always read to them when we went to bed when they were very small. And the boys are all very good readers. And so I never denied the boys many things, but they were never very hard to satisfy with things. Yeah. Then in '66, 12 years later, we moved into our house that we lived in until we retired in 2017. They all participated, like in the summertime. They all played baseball, and their mother and their mother's friend were the ones. Those days they didn't have school buses and stuff to haul kids around, so mother and her friend were always the one that had to haul the kids around. In the same way at basketball, in the wintertime, we'd always haul kids around. As the boys, they always worked out, like I said, and they never created any problems. That's one thing I can be blessed with. The boys never created any problems for us. I'd always worked, so I always had them start mowing lawns and doing things for other people. Got them selling Christmas cards and gadgets. And Merle was the first one that started it. And then Robin took it over. And so I think that's how Robin decided to go into the business of marketing, because he was selling these Christmas cards. You want to be able to be self-reliant on your own and take care of yourself. And they took care of themselves financially too. I guess I didn't realize that until I started thinking about it. I didn't think I had much vacations, but a lot of the times in the earlier years, we'd always spend long weekends. But in the earlier years, I could get away because I could get barbers to fill in for me. But after I'd say back in around 1970 or so, I could never get anybody to fill in anymore. So I'd have to close the shop. And you don't close the shop on people when they drive 30, 40 miles. Barbers used to have apprentices work for them. And my neighbor in town, Adams, he always had an apprentice work for him. And he'd let his apprentice come and work for me when I'd go on vacation. And they liked that because they're a lot busier in my one-chair shop. And I was always generous with them. I let them keep it all. When I went to California, I got a barber from Larimore. And so he filled in, and I told him he could have all the money, but just give me 10% for pay for the fuel and lights and stuff, and he agreed to that. I was gone for 5 weeks, and we were in Oregon, and I wanted to spend another week. So I called and asked him if he could get permission from his boss to spend another week. He said, I'll check. And he called to check with his boss, and he said, no, you got to get back because the air base is opening up in Grand Forks, North Dakota on the 1st of April. So you got to get back here. We got to be ready when they come. So I had to come back. I trusted people, and I only had trouble with one person that was a renter of mine, and I left the door open for him because he didn't have money for a telephone. He was bad on me, and he was taking money out of my till when I'd go home at noon hour, took some other thing. That's the only thing I ever missed out of my barber shop, I think. But honesty is a big thing. You know, you're working alone, and I'd go for coffee. Well, I didn't lock the door. I left the door open so the clients could come in and sit down. Well, I had a button. I had a table sitting there with a button on it, and I had a sign on it, push the blue button, and I'll be right with you. And so I come right back, and so they all got accustomed to that. And when I needed a new one, I talked to a guy down in Chicago. He said he didn't have anything like that, but he said, I have one that works off batteries. My other one was on electricity. But he said, batteries, and I don't know how far it'll go. He said, if you'd like, you can try that out and see if that works for you. And I said, okay, do you want my credit card or you want a check or what do you want? Well, anybody who would trust people to go and sit in their barber shop, he said, I guess I'll trust you that you'll pay me after you get it. So I got it, and it worked fine. So I sent him a check. When I started in Edinburgh, I worked 6 days a week. and we were open on Saturday nights the year round. In the summer, we were open on Wednesday nights. The band would play, and I would start at 8 in the morning, and on Wednesday nights, I usually got done by 10, 11 on Wednesday nights. But on Saturday nights, that was a big night in town, and I would never get out of the shop till 11 and 12 when I started at 8 in the morning. But one time, on the 4th of July, was on a Saturday night. The 4th was the next day, and I was busy all day. Louise brought me out a sandwich, and I ate it in the barber shop while I was working. And so that night, I worked until it was 2:45 in the morning, and I still had 2 clients left, and I said to these guys, I said, you know, my back is giving me so sore, I don't think I can cut your hair, but if you come back in the morning, I'll give you a haircut. And they're pretty happy guys by that time anyway. And so they said, oh, no problem. Well, I said, how about I'll meet you at 9 o'clock in the morning? And they said, okay. So I got up, and I didn't think they'd show up. When I got there at 9 o'clock, they were sitting out front waiting for me, just as happy as they were when I left them at 3 o'clock in the morning. We had an exchange student that we got in 1978. And that year he was there, he always says it's the best year of his life. If it wasn't for you, I would not be in the position I am now. Well, now he says you don't have 3 sons. He always says that you have 4 sons. And he has become an American citizen now, and he just got that here last month. He'll have dual citizenships now, and he's married, living in Florida. I was just down there 2 weeks ago and spent 2 weeks with him. We stayed in Edinburgh because that was the beginning of the long hair in '69. But in Edinburgh, it didn't hurt me because every town around there were towns like 12 miles away, 15 miles away, 14 miles away, and all those towns had barbershops. But as they died off, they are retired and died off, I picked up a lot of clients from them, so the long hair didn't affect me. So when I moved to Edinburgh, 80% of my clientele came within a 6-mile radius because there were so many farmers at that time. And when I left Edinburgh now, retired from there, 75% of my clients come from beyond 6 miles, from all these other towns. I had them driving from towns like 60 miles away and 50 miles away and 30 miles to Grafton and that, and Cavalier. So my clientele come a long ways. And now I'm living in Grand Forks. I still cut hair by appointments only. And these guys, I've got one client that comes from Walhalla, that's 110 miles from here. And I've got 2 or 3 from Cavalier that come 90 miles, and I got some from Edinburgh, and I got them from Inkster and all the towns around. And I had one client that came to Edinburgh from Lairmore, North Dakota, and that was 55 miles. When I retired, then he was 92 years old, and his children wouldn't let him drive Grand Forks. So I said, well, if you could drive to Edinburgh all the time for haircuts, I guess I can go out and give you your haircuts at Lairmore. He's still alive. I went out and gave him a haircut the other day, and he's 102 years old, and he still takes care of his house, and his wife is 96. I really enjoy it. What I enjoy mostly about are the old clients that drive that far to come here. When somebody comes 100 miles to get a haircut, it kind of means something to you. It's, patriotism, I always said my customers weren't just customers, they become my friends. My customers were mostly friends, Benny, the long hair was on, and I cut Robin's hair. He looked in the mirror, and he must have thought I cut it too short. And so he went out the door, and he kind of slammed the door, and he walked by the big window in front, and he looked back at me, and I just let him go. When I got home at noon hour, I said, Robin, I said, did I cut your hair shorter than you liked? And, yeah, he said, well, I'm sorry if I did, I said, but I said, I don't want you ever to slam the door on me again and look at me like that again, and he never did. Merle always knew that he wanted to be a lawyer, and he went to law school, and Robin always said he wanted to go to business school and marketing, and that's just what he did. And Stephen wanted to be in politics, and that's just what he did, and then he became a lawyer also. And he passed on when he was 42 years of age. He was getting out of politics and just going to join a law firm. Merle worked as a lawyer till he was 61 years old, and he got Alzheimer's, so he had to retire. Robin retired the first time when he was 42 years old, And now he's just on board of directors for companies. He's on about 6 or 7 companies. He's a board of director. I wanted the boys to go to college. I wanted, when I was a young boy, I wanted to become an optometrist, but there was no money for it at that time. So this is the way I went this route. So that's why when the boys talked about barbering, I said, no, you want to go on to something else. And so there was never a doubt in their mind when they went to school was to go off to college. There was never a mind in any one of them. Proud of my boys that they were so successful. So successful, and their daughters too, both. That's really quite a success in life. What more can you want? And had a good life. And had a good wife. You know, when you grow up and you see your boys grow up and become successful, what more can you expect expect in life? You can have all the money you want, but seeing them go on is really quite an achievement.